Podcast. Igniting both the art and the science of functional medicine. Here's your host, Dr. Brad Watts.
Welcome back to the Nutrition Hero Podcast, everybody. What do you know today? Good to be here. I'm Dr. Brad Watts, by the way. Thank you for joining me on the next episode. Very cool. Shout out to the new subscribers to the podcast. We've been seeing the trend going upwards, and that's kind of fun. Kind of fun because it's not something that we necessarily set out to do. We wanted to put information out there into the atmosphere, so to speak, and leave this information in the marketplace for people that are interested. And it's kind of fun to see that happen. But then also the list of listeners growing. Weird, I gotta tell you. It's an odd experience for me. So anyway, cool. So thank you to all of you that are subscribers on iTunes or Stitcher or however else you're listening to it. Hitting the thumbs up button on YouTube, and we appreciate it. So very cool. I think I might be getting some Nutrition Hero stickers organized coming out soon, and we'll find a place to put those so you can get them, and something obviously that you can put on your water bottle, put them on your computer, whatever you want, and let people know you are the nutrition hero, not me. You're the one that's doing it, and that's really what this podcast is all about: is getting you into that nutrition hero mode, that mindset, because that's really what it is. Getting you into that mindset where you can serve your community, change somebody's life, change their family's life, and then start changing communities with some health and healing. Giving people an opportunity to express vitality for once in their life. That's what it's all about. So anyway, thank you guys for being along in the journey, participating in it, and it's really a group effort. I get to be, as I'm sure I've said 1,000 times on these podcasts, I get to be out in the United States traveling, teaching on a monthly basis, and get to meet so many of you, and it's exciting for me to see that there's even a hint of an impact happening, just a hint. And the reason is that I just want to plant seeds of health and healing for people so that they can then take the result of that and just like lay it down and start getting some grassroots traction in natural health care. And it's cool. It's happening. You see it. And so for all of you that I get to meet when we're out and about, I appreciate meeting you, and I appreciate every single story that you have about being a nutrition hero in your community, and I think it's fun. So anyway, it gives me goosebumps when I talk about it. Goodness. So today what we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about copper and iron. Iron and copper. We're going to be discussing the relationship between the two things, but also how both of them can drive a specific condition that got me interested in this over the last week. By the way, most of these podcasts come out of my clinical practice / the consulting practice, where reading lab work or otherwise, and it's interesting because these are problems that you see in the lab chemistry, or a doctor's having with a patient, or I'm having with my own patients, and you got to get creative and you got to figure out how to solve them. So one of the things that I like, especially in 2019 when this episode's being recorded, is that there's not a lot of information that we need above and beyond what we already have in order to help people. Like, you get that? There's not a lot of cutting-edge new technologies that are needed to change most of these chronic disease situations. Now, what's going to happen is most chronic diseases are going to get easier to treat over time, except the ones, obviously, that pharma's making a ton of money off of. Those aren't going to change anytime soon. But what I was going to say is that chronic diseases are going to get easier to treat over time as technologies develop and make it easier for people to still live their crappy lifestyles, but manage their condition more effectively. And that's really where chronic disease care is heading in the United States. And that's fine if that's what people want to do. But as far as like health and wholeness and wellness and vitality are concerned, there's going to be a lifestyle for every single person out there that's compatible with their unique DNA signature. And that's important to know. And so if we have ways of making it easier to cope with pain, great, right? However, they still got to ask the question, why is the pain there? And if the pain's there because of a lifestyle factor, there's nothing that's going to be better for that patient than avoiding the thing that's causing the flagrant pain. And that's easy to understand, but maybe it's easy to understand just because of the perspective we're sitting in. So anyway, let's start talking about iron and copper here as it relates to cognitive decline. And so before I got off on that rabbit trail, one of the things that I was going to tell you is that most of the time these podcasts are coming out of daily experience and then problem solving and how you get around these different issues by looking into that patient's unique DNA signature or the result of it, which would be the chemistries. And that's fun. It's fun for me to be the detective in that type of a situation. Now, if you've ever seen patients with cognitive decline in your own practice, it's not pretty, right? There's nothing romantic about it. There's nothing, and I mean romantic like, think about being a doctor and helping people get rid of different conditions and things and all this stuff. And that's what pulls on your heartstrings to want to be a doctor in the first place. But I'm telling you, with cognitive decline, there's nothing about it that, makes you love the situation. Right now, I like the results of helping people out of it, but there's nothing about it that is like enticing. You go, yeah, let's get more of those patients going on. Except that if I don't help them, who's gonna? That's literally it. And so in this instance, looking at cognitive decline cases, and you see patients that have high iron and low iron, and yet both of them have a manifestation of cognitive decline. And it turns out that high and low iron can certainly contribute to various forms of cognitive decline as part of an overall umbrella under that Alzheimer's condition. So anyway, very interesting. But what I was doing is I was sitting here reading some research articles and came across a website called GreenMed Info that I've used a bunch of times, and they have a good job of explaining things from a natural healthcare perspective. GreenMed Info, and it's cool. So I don't agree with everything they have to say, not even close to everything they have to say, but it's an interesting spot for information, especially if you're not somebody that is schooled in natural healthcare as of yet. If this is something you're just getting into, they have unique perspective on quite a few different hot topics. And so, anyway, I was reading an article talking about iron deficiency anemia. And for those of you that are not schooled in iron deficiency anemia, let's go through some of the things, some of the triggers or some of the causes to an anemia pattern, and let's see if we can come out the other side with some level of clinical pearl for serving patients that have cognitive decline. So anyway, how to get an iron anemia. Maybe that's what we should title this podcast. How to get an iron anemia. So leading to an iron deficiency, number one, bleeding. A bleed out, a gross bleed out, absolutely you're going to see that. If you have gross bleeding, something that is manifesting visual blood in stool or otherwise, you can develop an anemia pattern. Absolutely, blood loss. So including heavy menstruation, right? Including that. Blood loss, by far, it would be the fastest way to end up in an anemic state. So another thing to think about would be absorption, especially patients that might have celiac disease or inflammatory bowel disease, or maybe they just have a ton of something called lipopolysaccharides that are destroying their gut. We might have talked about that in a previous episode. And so poor absorption is certainly out there for people. Hypochlorhydria would be another one if we have a decreased acid-base balance in the gut, specifically the stomach. If we have a decreased acid-base balance situation happening here, it could be genetic. Maybe the patient has an autoimmune disease where they're not creating hydrochloric acid the right way. Maybe the patient has it secondary, like to an H. pylori infection, which would be the most common infection that's passed between people in the United States, from what I've read. And that can cause hypochlorhydria. What are the signs of that? We have gas, bloating, indigestion, heartburn, belching, all of it, diarrhea. And since nobody has any of those problems, move on to the next one, right? Pathogenic issues, you can have like yeast, fungus, parasites that they use up iron stores and they block absorption, certainly. Speaking of which, inflammation can block absorption. Toxicity, like if you have a heavy metal toxicity, it can interfere with the patient's ability to specifically bind iron. absorb it. I've seen mercury would be another one. This is interesting. Let's say a patient has inability to clear mercury out of their body and they have a bunch of silver fillings or whatever it might be. Well, they start digging in, and mercury can interfere with the synthesis of usable iron. Sure, you absorb it, but can you use it? Right? Well, not if it's not in the right form. You can. Not even close. Not even close. What about competitive absorption is another one that we find quite often, especially with supplements like calcium. So you get every lady over the age of 40 that's using calcium trying to improve their DEXA scores and make sure they don't end up with brittle bones as they age. And certainly, all right, certainly they can end up with an iron anemia situation because of that. Calcium is a competitive binder, competitive with iron, so certainly can cause it. What about this? Extreme exercise. You're not going to see a lot of this in a functional medicine practice, but maybe if you're a sports chiro or a PT or a nutritionist, you might be your jam right here. Working with athletes and long distance runners and that type of thing, they can develop anemia patterns quite easily. Lack of dietary exposure, certainly, especially today's day and age. You get all this stuff that I grew up in the 80s and 90s, right? So you get 80s and 90s, what are you doing? You're eating cereal that's been fortified with iron. All of it. Right? Remember the Raisin Bran and your gut ache at about 9:30 in the morning? All of it. So we don't do that anymore. Not a lot. Nope. Your bread doesn't say fortified with iron and vitamin C anymore. It's not there. And so we end up with a lack of dietary exposure, especially patients that are in a vegetarian, vegan situation. If they're not specifically trying to engage in iron, it's a tough spot. Coincidentally, the iron that is coming out of plant-based products is less absorbable than the stuff that's coming out of animal products. And that's just a fact. So something to think about for people that are serving those of a vegetarian persuasion. Genetic factors, certainly, if you have decreased ability to absorb iron, it could certainly be related to a genetic predisposition that you don't know about. So that could certainly be the case. Here's the last one, though, that I want to talk about. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just from the article that I was mentioning. And this is what spawned a little bit of a research dive, and it's this: low ceruloplasmin. Ceruloplasmin. You don't hear that very often. And bioavailable copper causes the body to store iron in the liver and brain instead of allowing it to circulate. Well, hello, that's one of the main issues in cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, is one of the main triggers or threats can be heavy metal toxicity. So ceruloplasmin is ceruloplasmin, ceruloplasmin. And so I hadn't read about ceruloplasmin in a long time. I mean, I remember reading about it in physiology, but as far as applied physiology or using it in a functional setting, not a lot of information over the last 4 or 5 years about it. And so I thought, why not refresh a little bit? Why not dig out a few things? And so ceruloplasmin, by the way, is an interesting one. And it's something that you're going to find in your cognitive decline crowd. And by the way, diabetic patients. By the way, autoimmune patients. By the way, anybody that's dealing with rheumatoid specifically. Anybody that's dealing with multiple sclerosis or even Parkinson's. Ceruloplasmin is an interesting one. So it's kind of off the radar, as I mentioned, in functional medicine from that perspective, and I don't really think it should be after doing some of this research. So anyway, what is it? Ceruloplasmin is the main copper-carrying protein in the bloodstream, and it's a major player in iron metabolism, which you'll find here momentarily. It's basically an enzyme, is what its function is, and like most of these, where are you going to have them made? The liver. So this ceruloplasmin carries around 95% of the body's iron stores. 95% is actually bound to this ceruloplasmin. And the other 5% in various tissues. However, 95% is going to be in ceruloplasmin circulating. And what it does, ceruloplasmin, is it participates in oxidation reactions. So it takes ferrous iron and turns it into ferric iron. So what do we know that as? It turns ferritin into serum iron. And if you have any time in the functional medicine world at all, you know that this is going to be an important reaction. How many times have you looked at a patient where their iron levels are like 40, serum iron, 40, ferritin, 210. Right? This is what we're talking about here. Essentially, if we want to have normal serum iron, normal hemoglobin, normal red blood cell function, normal non-anemic state, we have to have enough iron in this ferric state, right? This serum iron state, we have to have enough of it available. And that can only happen because of ceruloplasmin. When ceruloplasmin is low, we don't get the transfer from ferritin into serum iron. This is critical. This is critical. So if we look at that storage form of iron, where's it going to get stored? The liver and the brain. The liver and the brain. So clinically, if we have low serum iron and elevated storage form of iron called ferritin, this is literally a result of decreased ceruloplasmin. This is interesting because if you have an iron overload, that is one of the things that can contribute to an actual diagnostic change in your MRI volumes for patients that are dealing with Alzheimer's. We know this. It's in the medical literature, right? Now, if we look at ceruloplasmin, it can be low as a result of a couple of different things. One would be easy, decreased copper. If you don't have copper to keep the molecule together, ceruloplasmin is not going to stick around very long, right? So it can't do its job if we don't have copper. So I think it's 6, 5, maybe it's 7. I'm going to go with 6. 6 molecules, or atoms rather, of copper, right? 6 per molecule of ceruloplasmin, right? 6. And it's interesting to me because when you look at a lack of copper in your diet, you're just not going to create that ceruloplasmin appropriately, and that can lead to high ferritin, low serum iron. A copper intake issue. This is interesting. So obviously, if we're going to have low ceruloplasmin, it can also be from a genetic inability to absorb it, or something like Wilson's disease. So anyway, now let's say we're in a spot though where the genetic issues and Wilson's disease, those are off the table. We're not talking about a patient that has a genetic issue like that that's going to be found when they're a little kid. Right? Let's say that the patient's coming into your practice with decreased cognitive function. Maybe they have decreased liver function, and maybe they have balance issues. Let's say that, right? These can all be a result of decreased ceruloplasmin and accompanied by an increase of iron deposition into the neurologic tissue. And that right there is the crux of the matter. Right? See, this is a scary one on lab testing. This is the one where you have massive inflammation, massive ferritin. It's got to be stored somewhere. And if you got to pick, don't choose the brain, for crying out loud. Pick something else. Right? Pick something else. This is interesting to me. So low ceruloplasmin can lead to high ferritin. High ferritin can obviously lead to our Alzheimer's situation, or at least at the very least, some level of cognitive decline spectrum. Interesting. But what about the opposite side of the spectrum? Right? So if you understand that ceruloplasmin is required in order to take iron, move it into serum iron so that we have some level of balance. And if the patient's anemic, one of the things to look for is maybe low ceruloplasmin, which would be just drive their copper intake up and see how they do. What if it's the opposite? What if we have excess? What if we're looking at excess ceruloplasmin? What are we looking at in this type of a scenario? Remember what it is. It's a copper-carrying molecule that doesn't exist very long without copper. So the main driver in excess ceruloplasmin is going to be excess copper. And this is one of the things that you find patients that have been taking their multivitamins since the 80s. Everybody's been using the same Centrum or whatever it is, right? And they're just pounding away. They don't know how much copper is in their multivitamin. They have no idea, right? Why? Because nobody ever looks. They're just taking it because it's a good idea, right? I want to do something that makes me feel better about my chances of staying healthy. So anybody using their multivitamin for the last 30 years and doesn't know their copper toxicity, this is a problem, right? So we've had Dr. Shade on the podcast before, Chris Shade at Quicksilver Scientific, and they're like the best in the game, man, when it comes to heavy metal testing, in my opinion. The consistency, the repeatability of the testing too, but the consistency of how fast you get your results and the interventions that you can come up with are phenomenal. The best in the game. So one of the things that you want to think about, though, is with copper toxicity, what is one of the reasons for that? Well, specifically, you could be taking in too much. Okay, that's one issue. Secondly, you could not, what if you're not spending the copper appropriately? Like, If you ever heard of superoxide dismutase, we might have talked about this in a previous episode, but superoxide dismutase is required in order to process specifically glutathione. So when your body has a breakdown in its ability to use glutathione, like in a transsulfuration pathway, genetically speaking, what happens is oftentimes we don't have a hydrogen peroxide molecule in order to be spending right on oxidizing glutathione. Well, what takes place is superoxide dismutase. It might not be doing its job. Guess what superoxide dismutase requires in order to do its job, in order to create that hydrogen peroxide? Needs stinking copper. It needs copper, all right? And guess what else it needs? Zinc. It needs zinc. So if you need zinc and copper for SOD to do its job in order for you to have proper detox reactions, but we find you in a spot where we have excess ceruloplasmin, right? It might not be that you have excess dietary copper. It might be that you actually have a zinc deficiency, so we're not spending copper in one of our main areas that we're going to spend copper, detoxification reactions. We're not spending it appropriately, right? I don't know the ratio off the top of my head, but let's say for every 1 zinc you get to spend 3 copper, and if I'm not spending that 1 zinc in the superoxide dismutase pathway that I'm talking about, that means I'm also not spending the 3 copper, and it tends to pile up. And again, the ratio is arbitrary. It's not what I'm talking about. All right, so superoxide dismutase, remember, is that enzyme required to dampen much of the body's inflammation. It's required, right? And if you want to process inflammation, you have to have SOD activity. And if you want SOD activity, you got to have copper and zinc to be present in order to work right away, every time. So if you have a patient with lots of inflammation, one of the things I'm looking at potentially is they don't process glutathione effectively. Who might this be? Patients that have high GGT. High GGT. When you can't process glutathione effectively, oftentimes what happens is instead of clearing it out, your body's going to put it back into the top of the transsulfuration pathway, right? Glutathione through the GGT enzymatic activity, and the GGT score goes up. And so if a GGT score goes up and everything else is healing, one of the things you want to think about is superoxide dismutase activity might not be doing its job. Might be copper, might be iron, might be zinc. All right? So anyway, just want to look at that. So if you have a patient with lots of inflammation, don't forget, right, zinc-copper ratio can be an important situation here. All right? Test. Basically test. Just run one of the Quicksilver Scientific blood metals panels, look at it, see what you're dealing with, and whether or not your patient has the opportunity to improve the ratio. Just improve the ratio. All right, so systemic inflammation, chronic inflammation that's not going away, what kind of patients have that? Right? Lymphoma, rheumatoid, Alzheimer's patients, OCD patients, like little kids that have OCD, even adults with OCD, but behavioral disorders sometimes. Right? Essentially, any chronic condition that's dealing with inflammation is what I'd be looking at as far as copper to zinc ratio. Even patients that have things like psoriasis, epilepsy, right? This is key, absolutely key in organizing the body's ability to balance and create homeostasis once again. So if we have high levels of oxidative stress, if we have high levels of inflammation and all this stuff, we want to make sure that we have some level of copper to zinc ratio, some level of an ability to organize this. And how do you know unless you test, right? Anyway, let's bring it back to Alzheimer's disease here. So if we have, just to review, if we have low levels of copper and we can have low levels of ceruloplasmin, what happens is we can have high levels of ferritin. That ferritin, that storage form of iron, can be deposited in brain and liver tissue, so nervous system and liver tissue. And ultimately, that's not going to be helpful for your patient. Not if they want to get better, right? And so what are we going to do? We're going to go through a bunch of different chelation reactions trying to help this patient get better, and ultimately, they need to be able to spend iron more effectively. Spend it more effectively, not just get rid of it, right? Spend more, and this is, again, without Wilson's disease or any weird genetic thing going on. So this is a critical thing to look at on your heavy metal testing when you're looking at patients from a cognitive perspective. Absolutely critical. Low ceruloplasmin. Now, on the opposite side of things, high ceruloplasmin can happen because we're not taking appropriate levels of competitive binders, not taking in appropriate levels of zinc, let's say, right? And we're just allowing copper to build up. It can also happen because we're taking too much stinking copper because we've been taking the same multivitamin for 30 years and nobody tells us to do anything different, right? This is the spot where you're going to find patients at the beginning of care, right? The ones that have been trying to take care of themselves for decades. That's where it's at. And we can test this. Okay, so look at your patient's laboratory intake and figure out where are they on this spectrum from a ceruloplasmin perspective. Do they have high ferritin? Potentially we have low ceruloplasmin because we're not converting it into serum iron. Do we have high ceruloplasmin, right, where we have lower amounts of ferritin, high amounts of iron, large amounts of oxidative stress, right? In this instance, we want to look for that zinc issue. And maybe you'll find some Th1 inflammatory issues on top of that, where you could potentially look at high levels of HDL. We could be looking at SED rates that are higher than what they need to be, you name it. So anyway, just want to do a few minutes here. Anyway, this is your 20-minute reminder to look at this with your patients. And if you're not going to test ceruloplasmin, you don't need to if you don't want to. Look for the reflection of its function is what I'm saying. So look for that GGT. Look for that stored form of iron, ferritin. Look for the reflection of ceruloplasmin function. Alright, so kind of a deep dive when we're talking about ceruloplasmin, talking about iron and zinc and copper and all this stuff. However, I wanted to make sure we get this out there because this is something that's absolutely critical in understanding your own cognitive function as well. So if you have labs on yourself, what's your ferritin look like? What's your serum iron look like? Right? Yeah, you might not be anemic. That's fine. I'm saying, though, how's your function? Right? How's your function? So let's check it out. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to email me. All right. Love you guys. Enjoy the rest of your day.